Good evening and welcome to IndyStar Election Night Live. I'm Kaitlin Lange, your host tonight, and IndyStar's government and politics editor. Polls are now closed in most of Indiana, and as we wait for results, we'll be here talking about the marquee races throughout the state, including the gubernatorial race and Indiana's 5th congressional district. Later on tonight, I'll be joined by opinion editor James Briggs, Democratic strategist Lindsay Haake, and former Republican mayoral candidate Abdul-Hakim Shabazz. But for now, I'm starting out with Brittany, Carloni, and Kayla Dwyer, our 2 Statehouse reporters here at IndyStar. Brittany, Kayla, thanks for being here and taking a break from writing your stories. And from eating copious amounts of pizza.
Absolutely.
What races should we be watching tonight? Kayla, I'll start with you.
Well, obviously, I'm very interested in the governor's race, as is everyone. Hoosiers have never seen 6 people running for this nomination before. And not just like no-namers either. We've got several well-known to us anyway, U.S. Senator Mike Braun, a sitting lieutenant governor in Suzanne Crouch, Brad Chambers, our former Commerce Secretary, another former Commerce Secretary, Eric Doden, former Attorney General Curtis Hill, that's a recognizable name, and Indianapolis mother of 5, Jamie Rittenauer. I've seen some people call it a campaign about nothing, which is, but it's been an interesting ride for the sheer number of people and the sheer dollar signs that have been in this race. Just so much money involved and mudslinging, which is kind of newer for Indiana politics. So it will be fascinating to see who Hoosiers pick for that one.
Yeah, I feel like I can't turn on my TV these days without seeing another ad from one of the candidates. I make my husband like pause the show and get out my phone so I can record real quick. And,
yep.
So now, Brittany, you obviously have focused more on federal races. Mm-hmm. What races are you watching tonight?
Well, as a former Hamilton County reporter, I am specifically interested in the 5th congressional district race. Back in 2022, when Victoria Sparks didn't have an opponent, in the primary, I wrote about that race. This is a whole different scenario. Back in 2023, in February of 2023, she announced she wasn't going to run for re-election, and then February this year, she jumped back in the race and fully turned that primary upside down. There are 9 candidates running in that race, but it's mostly been a real battle between Representative Sparks and State Rep Chuck Goodrich of Noblesville. It'll be really interesting to see if voters say, yeah, we're going to give her another term in Congress, or if they say this back and forth was too much and you're done. Right.
I know there's also another one that overlaps with Indianapolis that we're kind of looking at. Can you talk about that race a little bit too?
Yeah, absolutely. The 6th congressional district race, that's where Mike Pence's brother, Greg Pence, has been the congressman for that district since about 2018 was when he was first elected. He announced earlier this year that he was not going to seek re-election, which is a rare opportunity, and so 7 Republicans have come forward to run for that seat. A lot of familiar names in that race as well, specifically Jefferson Shreve, who ran for mayor of Indianapolis last year. A lot of state house figures like State Rep Mike Speedy and State Senator Jeff Rotz, but also newcomers like Jamison Carrier, he's grabbed a lot of national headlines for his personal story about his stepson dying from a fentanyl overdose. And that's resonated with a lot of people. That's been a big issue, is like the border crisis and how that applies to drug issues as well.
Yeah, he got a Ramaswamy endorsement.
Vivek Ramaswamy was here last week and did a rally with him, so that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, wow, fascinating. In terms of the governor's race, obviously that is the one that probably most of the state is focused on. Who would you say the front runners are as of right now? I mean, obviously polls closed in most of the state at 6 p.m., but we still don't have results yet. We won't for a while. So who are the front runners we could expect tonight?
Yeah, front runner in terms of polling, not in terms of results yet, but Senator Mike Braun has held pretty comfortable lead in polling throughout this campaign season, and by double digits over his competitors. I would put, at first, I would have clumped 3 of the others in a second place category, but now it seems to have narrowed to 2 people in a distant second place, which would include Lieutenant Governor Suzanne Crouch and former Commerce Secretary Brad Chambers. Interestingly, seeing a lot of social media chatter today about various people pulling protest ballots essentially and voting for Chambers, like people who typically vote Democrat, and that was a little bit of a campaign out there. A PAC out there has been asking people to do that, so it's interesting to see that play out a little bit. It'll be interesting to see how actually prevalent that is versus my own Twitter sphere.
Right. I also think the interesting thing about Brad Chambers is I feel like he has a lot more support in central Indiana, so
Yes.
I'm very curious. I mean, it seems we had IndyStar reporters go out and, talk to voters today, but they're obviously talking to voters in central Indiana.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
a lot of them said, hey, we're voting for Brad Chambers, but I'm curious what that looks like throughout the rest of the state. I assume it is, not the same as it is here.
Yeah.
Very
So,
good point, yeah.
Going back to the 5th district, you spoke about how Victoria Spartz initially said, no, I'm not going to run for re-election, and then changed her mind. What impact has that had on that race? Is she still certain to win? What do things look like right now?
I mean, that's a really great question. For folks like me and other political fans, you saw the impact on that race as like literally the afternoon that she announced, I think way back early February, she said, hey, I'm jumping back in. And think about this, at this point, people who had filed for that race had been campaigning for months. And she jumped back in and she gets the power of incumbency and the name recognition and the ability to say, I've been in DC, I've been doing this job, but that afternoon after she announced, people like Chuck Goodrich and Max Engling, who previously worked in DC for the former Speaker Kevin McCarthy of California, they came out with negative messages immediately, and that followed by a lot of community leaders, like I think Noblesville Mayor Chris Jensen publicly tweeted that he was supporting Chuck Goodrich, and that's not the best sign for a congressional incumbent, but no, it turned into a really nasty race, especially when internal polling from both campaigns showed that Chuck Goodrich and Victoria Spartz, it's really been a battle between those two, and I think we've seen it on the internet, we've seen it in TV ads, we've seen it in some really interesting mailers.
Yeah, I know. We saw a mailer going around on Twitter of Chuck Goodrich in a pink tutu, and I just did not have that on my bingo card for this election.
For the variety of races that we have on ballots this year, I think that was a bit of a surprise that it went that far in that negative realm between those two.
Yeah, I also wonder if it forced candidates to maybe loan their campaigns more money than they initially had intended, because I think we saw Goodrich and Spartz loan money to their campaigns, right?
So, and we've written about this both in the congressional races and in the governor's race, but in the 5th district race, I think as of like mid-April or so, Chuck Goodrich had loaned his campaign about $4.6 million, and I saw about 75% of that came after Victoria Spartz jumped back into the race. And I've talked to people as well that that really allowed Chuck Goodrich to have money to be able to shape what Victoria Spartz's record was. So he got to highlight her support for the Ukrainian funding that the federal government has given, and that's been not the most popular issue among Republicans.
Yeah. I know obviously money always plays a major role in elections, but it seems like in this specific primary we've seen a lot of candidates loan themselves money. I mean, that race we talked about, and then also at a couple others, like the governor's race, 6th district race. I guess how has that shown itself in those other races, and how has that impacted those races, Kayla?
Yeah, I mean, the governor's race, I looked back to at least the late 90s, and I didn't really see much of any self-funding until this primary. Tens of millions of dollars of personal wealth. I mean, Brad Chambers has been the biggest contributor to that. He loaned himself $10 million, his campaign $10 million. Eric Doden, to some extent, he loaned himself from his own bank account, but also his family chipped in quite a bit, a combination of donations and loans. Quite a bit, as in several $1 million. So, it sort of speaks to that level of competition that we haven't seen before. But, when we talk to people for example, in some Campaign Legal Center in New York or Brennan Center, national experts, they're pretty shocked at how many Indiana races have this degree of self-funding, like when you look at nationally, particularly in some of the congressional races. And I think like it does sort of up the ante, raise this playing field for people to get into politics. It already has been an increasingly expensive game, but if you look at the stats from like 2000 to 2020, quadruple the amount of self-funding just in terms of sheer dollars. So, it just increasingly feels like a rich person's game to be competitive.
But I've also seen, and I think you've seen this as well in the governor's race, when we were doing profiles like earlier in the primary season, when I was writing about Brad Chambers, I saw a lot of questions about what exactly are they doing with that money, because not a lot of them used that money to take significant hits at Mike Braun, who's been the front runner the whole time.
That's
pretty much.
Yeah. I mean, for a while you really, you started to see it in some of the debates, but it was definitely, it felt like a slower runway before the candidates started attacking Braun, which I was very surprised about. I mean, even, I think it was the first debate, it was like halfway through the debate by the time that Brad Chambers attacked Mike Braun, and it felt kind of like it
was still tentative.
It was like still kind of awkward, like trying to get it out. So
Doden's really the only one who actually hit Braun in the airwaves with negative. I mean, Chambers' ads have kind of hinted at, we don't want to elect the same old, but without naming him,
Now, in terms of self-funding campaigns, do voters care, or is money? It's just how you get your ads out, Brittany.
I think it's one of those things where we're going to really see that in real time this evening. I think about the 6th congressional district specifically. Jefferson Shreve, I believe, as of mid-April, we know he funded his mayoral campaign last year to record-breaking levels, but in his congressional campaign these last couple of months, he gave his campaign, I believe, $4.5 million as of mid-April or so, and he only received one $500 donation.
Wow.
And so he's been really, from what I've seen, he's been putting out messaging that, like, I'm not bought by special interests. And given the kind of idea that politicians are not real people, they're funded by other people, like, maybe that really will resonate with voters. Who's to say?
On the other hand, there's also some voters who would say, like, it's just these rich people, it's this sort of anti-elite sentiment, which is real. I mean, a lot of eye rolling on Twitter.
I was curious, I think it was you, Brittany, who talked to Brad Chambers about why he was donating the money. What was his response to explaining that?
When we were working on those profiles, when I spoke with him, it was one of those things where he recognized he's definitely a very fortunate person. He's not like the regular Hoosier out on the street that can say, I'm running for governor. But he did say, like, this, I really want to invest in this experience and I want people to know who I am, and it does cost money to get your name out there.
Right.
And it worked to some extent. I don't know if he would be where he's at in the polls without having done that.
Yeah, that's totally fair. When it comes to the races at the top of the ballot, we don't really have as much of a choice. Kayla, can you kind of explain what the status of the presidential race is? Because we do technically have a little bit of a choice, but not really.
Yeah, you could vote for Nikki Haley, but it won't matter. So if you pulled a Republican ballot today, you did see two names, Nikki Haley, the former UN ambassador, and Donald Trump. But Nikki Haley had dropped out after she made the Indiana ballot. So she's on there, but she's not actually running, and a vote toward her will not count toward anything. And Democrats only have President Joe Biden.
Yeah, so not a ton of choice. I always complain that we're so late in the primary cycle that Indiana just kind of, we don't really matter when it comes to that. It always bothers me every single time. So that's my petition, is we should move our primary up. You heard it here first. That's my plea. What about the U.S. Senate race? What are we looking at there, Brittany?
Well, that was really a question for months. Was Jim Banks going to have any opponent or competition in the primary? And I don't know if people were following back at the end of February, that seems years ago, but the Indiana Election Commission removed Jim Banks' only potential opponent, John Rust. He's a Seymour area egg farmer. He didn't meet the state's 2 primary law, which is essentially if you want to run for a specific party, you have to vote in their past 2 primary elections. And so Jim Banks is probably having a very easy night tonight, given the fact that he was the only name on Republican ballots for the U.S. Senate race. He's waiting to see who his opponent for November will be, and in the Democratic primary, it's Mark Carmichael, who's a former state representative, and Valerie McRae, who's a psychologist, and she actually ran for president in 2020, which was a very interesting conversation to have with her about that. But the 2 of them are facing off for a very monstrous task of the gargantuan money and endorsements and support of Donald Trump that Jim Banks has going to November. I think I remember describing it as a very like David and Goliath like scenario. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you got to think too, looking back at even 2 years ago with Senator Young, I mean, it was a pretty decisive victory there.
Oh, yeah.
So any Democrat in the U.S. Senate race is going to have an uphill battle. It's a hard one to win there.
Mm-hmm.
I do want to talk more about the governor's race. We had, like I mentioned earlier, we had reporters out talking to voters to kind of get their thoughts on who they were voting for. And again, I know we're just one part of the state, so it might not reflect the rest of the state, but there were a handful of people who specifically mentioned that they wanted to vote against Braun. I think only one voter said that they were voting for Senator Braun. I guess, does that tell us anything about the general feelings about Braun, Kayla?
Well, it tells us that what we're probably going to see at the end of the night, if Senator Braun is the nominee, it's going to be with a pretty small percentage of voters, I think. I mean, given these sentiments floating around, yet compare that with the fact that he has had such a strong lead in the polling. Even that lead has been, less than 40%, because so many voters are undecided. So if he pulls a win tonight, it's probably going to be the smallest voter mandate that we've seen for a primary winner in the gubernatorial race. Mm-hmm. And so it doesn't spell a whole lot of confidence from where I sit, and we'll have to see how that affects his capabilities in the governor's mansion.
Yeah. I really think that's also interesting as well, because he'll have to work to really coalesce the party around him, and
that's probably the key, actually, the bigger point.
Yeah, and I wonder how much that will be easy or not easy.
Yeah, I'm curious what impact this will have on, the Republican convention here in what, a month or so. We have, obviously either the convention delegates or Braun or both of them together need to pick an LG candidate. So I'm curious how much sway, Braun could have with candidates. I mean, what do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I actually was chatting with some folks today about this. I still think he hasn't hinted that he's going to have his own recommendation, and that's probably going to be. I don't want to make predictions. I mean, the more important thing is his relationship with the legislature is going to be most key, I think, for how he is effective as a governor. He's got to set a tone right away. He's got to start talking to people right away. So the convention's part of that, but I think probably most of his energy should be focused on talking to legislators.
I think that's a good point, because in Indiana we have a relatively weak governor. I mean, you could do a simple veto override, with just a simple majority. So it's not a whole lot of extra power that the governor has, and even if you look back at Holcomb's tenure, it still was a little contentious at times. And so I think I'm sure some of that will carry over to Braun as well.
Right, so. And whenever these candidates say, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, the natural question is always well, there's one thing in your way there.
Right, lawmakers. Right. Well, we do have some very, very early results, and this is 2% of the estimated voted, so we're talking super early results. But Mike Braun so far is in the lead with 43% of votes, followed by Suzanne Crouch with 23%, followed by Brad Chambers with 14%. Again, 2.1%.
Long ways to go.
Yeah, long ways to go. Not even all the polls are closed down, in Evansville and up in Lake County. So a lot could change, but this is at least an early window into how things are looking at this point in the night. So stay tuned. Those results are on IndyStar.com if you want to go over and see for yourself how these races are looking. There are other races coming in as well, so we will just keep bringing you results all night long. So Kayla, Brittany, thanks for being with us. I'll let you guys go get back to pizza and writing your stories and all of that. We are going to pivot to our panel of political commentators after this quick break. We're back at IndyStar Election Night Live, where we're talking about the marquee election races as we wait for results. I'm here with our panel now. We have James Briggs, IndyStar opinion editor and columnist. We have Abdul-Hakim Shabazz. He is a political commentator and editor of indypolitics.org. He also ran for Indy mayor as a Republican last year, so I'm sure we'll get some interesting insights from that experience tonight. And then we have Lindsay Haake over there, a longtime Democratic political strategist. Among her current clients is Democrat Attorney General candidate Destiny Wells, who's not on the ballot today, but will obviously still be an important race to watch coming up. So, for starters, what are you guys watching for tonight? James, we'll start with you.
Obviously, the governor's race, just to see if anyone can actually come close to Senator Mike Braun. He's been front runner since the day he announced. But also very low turnout today, so curious to see whether anyone can come close to him.
Yeah. What about you, Abdul? What are you watching for today?
Obviously, keep an eye on the governor's race like James is. What's interesting, though, in the governor's race is some internal polling I was privy to showed that Mike Braun, although back in November of last year, he was like at 40, in the low 40s, his numbers have actually been dropping and going sort of in a downward dissension. And in addition to that, I want to say he was like in the low to mid 20% range. However, Suzanne Crouch has been sort of picking up and sort of getting the momentum. So I do think it's between Mike Braun and Suzanne Crouch. The question is, if I'm going to use a racing analogy, does Suzanne can she make the finish line without having to make a pit stop? And so that has been the big challenge for her. Eric Doden, Brad Chambers, both good guys, good friends, but I don't see the momentum moving their way, so to speak. And they've also been beating up on Mike Braun, so once again, it leaves it open for Suzanne Crouch to sort of come in. Curtis Hill, Jimmy Rednauer, God love him, but it is what it is.
Right, yeah. And I mean, we do have, I mentioned this before our break, that we do have some early election results. Again, it's super early, so anything can happen. We're only at like 4.55% of the vote in, but Mike Braun is still in the lead right now with 38%. Suzanne Crouch behind at 21.2%.
See, once again,
yeah. So your analysis is right so far at least. So we'll see.
I always tell people the day in politics is a lifetime. So FYI, what I say today could be different in 10 minutes from now. So
right. Lindsay, what about you? What are you watching for today?
I would argue those poll workers certainly feel it's a lifetime because that's a long day for them. So first of all, I want to say thank you to all the poll workers who have dedicated their day today. I also think that 6-way primaries make for a very interesting day, and you could absolutely see some fall off where you wouldn't normally see it. I've seen the polling too and the trends that have come out of that, but I'm not necessarily sure that translates to a win still for Braun. I really think that could be a huge game changer tonight. It could be a toss-up. We could see a huge upset today, and a lot of money having been spent on this race. I think it has so much impact, just not only for the state of the Indiana Statehouse and so many complex issues we're dealing with right now that are essentially in a holding pattern, if you will, till a new administration comes in. And with $40 million in the hole, I mean, man, you're going to have some disappointment tonight.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really good point too, is that this primary is so different than most of the other previous years. So it's not like you've had a Republican candidate saying this is going to be my agenda when I go into the governor's office come January. So legislature, this is what we should do. No, it's the legislature being like, we don't know who's going to be in charge. So I think that's a really interesting dynamic. James, obviously you've written a number of controversial columns that we've gotten plenty of angry readers on, but among them, you've called Braun weak and inauthentic, and you've kind of labeled the other candidates' campaigns the same way. Are you not impressed with the field that we have had today?
I mentioned a moment ago that Mike Braun has led from the day he entered, but it's about as uninspiring of a front runner as you could ever have. He's had one forgettable term in the Senate where basically everything he's ever believed or said he would try to do, he's sort of like changed his mind at some point. He seems to have gotten bored and decided to run for governor for no particular reason. But yeah, I think it's also the case that the field behind him has not really captured the imagination of voters. We'll see what happens with the 6-person field tonight, but Brad Chambers sort of ran on this outsider label that I just don't think is really connected with people. He also entered late, and I just don't think has told a very good story about what the stakes are in this race and why it's so important for him to have entered and why it's so important for him to beat Mike Braun. Suzanne Crouch has occupied this strange space where she's the lieutenant governor actively running against the record of the incumbent governor, or the sitting governor, I should say. So just a really, really weird, uninspiring field from top to bottom.
Yeah, that's Abdul. What do you think of his analysis of the candidates there from your end?
Well, the thing about Mike Braun is Mike Braun has been sort of running as an outsider. It's like, but Mike, you're not an outsider. You were a school board member in Jasper. You were a state rep. Then you ran for the U.S. Senate. So your outsider status is very, very questionable at best. Matter of fact, the only real technically outsider would be Jamie Rittenauer, who has a snowball's chance in HE double hockey sticks of winning this thing this evening, because if you're Mike Braun, you're an insider. If you're Suzanne Crouch, you're an insider. And even if you're Brad Chambers and Eric Doden, you ran the Economic Development Commission. So you don't do that and get these things here unless you know how the game is played. So it's like Donald Trump in New York City. I'm an outsider, but how do you build tall buildings in New York and Chicago without knowing how the game is played? So this outsider status has been very questionable at best.
Yeah, and I mean, that's kind of how I would argue Braun won in 2018 was the outside label, because he had that famous commercial, where he had the cutouts of Rakita and Messer, and he was asking people in the streets of Jasper, I think, to tell them apart. So that was such
Todd Rakita didn't help himself either doing that race, too, if I must say so myself. So I'll just leave that.
I don't think Todd Rakita ever helps himself on anything.
I think that also shows the difference, though, between an interesting race and the boring race that we've had here. That Senate race that Mike Braun came out of, first of all, that was just a tremendous campaign that Mike Braun ran back in 2018, and now he just sort of opted to become a cardboard cutout of a generic politician, which partly because he had the front runner status, so he didn't really need to run a strong campaign. He just sort of needed to benefit on his name ID and the big endorsements he got from Donald Trump and Club for Growth. So it wasn't necessarily, he didn't need to play offense this time around, but no one else really did either. And that's why I think, to me, it's just been a really strange campaign.
Yeah. Lindsay, I mean, what do you think of the slate of candidates? Do you think this opens the window for Democrats?
I do. I do think it opens the window for Democrats. I also think, with Senator Braun being a sitting senator, being expected to be places and being literally on the floor of the Senate, which he chooses some days to do and some days apparently to not do. It sends a bad message to Hoosiers, I think, that you've got kind of a, maybe 50%, I'll throw a 50% on whether or not I'll be there today, and that just sends a bad message. We need somebody who's dedicated 100% of the time, and I mean, obviously we don't have a contested race for the gubernatorial candidate over on the Democratic side, but I mean, obviously Jennifer McCormick is going to be ready to hit that, hit all those points and show Hoosiers that she's ready to go and give whomever it is tonight, and I do think it's going to be a surprise, a run for their money.
Yeah. So now, Abdul, I'll ask you this. Which candidate tonight do you think, if there was a perfect world in your eyes, which candidate do you think would give Republicans the best chance of winning come November?
I would argue that the Republican, it depends. First of all, Indiana's a Republican state. So obviously if you're the Republican nominee, you're going to be a bit of a front runner. The question is, where do those sort of non-Donald Trump voters go, that 25, 30% that Donald Trump has sort of run into, even though he doesn't have an opponent. For example, Nikki Haley, some people said they just couldn't bring themselves to vote for Donald Trump. They just couldn't bring themselves to do it. Okay, fine, we get that. But Braun's got the Trump endorsement and all that other fun stuff. So the question is, where do those sort of non-Trump voters go? And it's sort of split between the three of them, because you got Curtis Hill saying he supports Trump, thought Trump was a victim of a witch hunt, whatever. You got Brad Chambers, Eric Doden, who sort of, it's like, hey, we kind of like Trump, but we're kind of keeping sort of on the down low, so to speak. So I think Trump, plays a role in this primary, but maybe not as much as people think he would.
Mm-hmm. Right. Lindsay, who would you want to see win tonight to give the Democrats the best chance of victory in November?
To give the Democrats the best chance of winning, obviously, I think I would be remiss if I didn't choose Jamie. Obviously she would be the easiest to beat. Not from any other standpoint, but just a policy readiness. I just don't think we have the chops in terms of being able to I know she's named people she wants to be in charge of state agencies and all of that. I get it, but I'm just not here ready to say that I would be confident as a Statehouse advocate if I had a choice of any of these folks. And I'll truly be honest with you, I really think any of them I could deal with it. I really could deal with any of these candidates. You walk into the building right now and you have a lack of leadership. You don't have anyone answering the phone, really, and you've had a governor who hasn't even been really in the Statehouse during legislative session. He made like 3 public appearances this legislative session. So I would be really positive and have that optimism I'd throw that cape of optimism on, but obviously that would be probably shrouded by January 8th. But I do think it would be the easiest person to beat would be Jamie, clearly.
Because nobody's ever heard of her and she's running on installing an actual theocracy, right? That's kind of a tough candidacy.
I mean, I would, just from the ability to look like she knows what she's perhaps doing. I think you had a day where she recalled a press release 3 times. I just don't think she knows what's
When I was covering one of the straw poll elections, this one, I think it was in the 6th district, that's the 6th district straw poll, Jamie Ritenour was there, and she had her Bible with her. And I'm like, okay, fine, you're a person of faith, I get it, but there's being a person of faith, there's almost sort of, she thinks Lady Doth protests a little bit too much. Because my question was okay, she's got her Bible with her, okay, that's fine, but as she walked across stage, she had her in her downstage hand, she's sort of walking back and forth so everybody in the audience could see it. I'm like, okay, was your husband in show choir or something? Because, this is really, really weird and just really, really awkward right now.
It would certainly be emblematic, though, of what many see the Statehouse already acting as, which is passing legislation that's in your bedrooms, in your business, in your kids' doctor's rooms, and all about being a theocracy. So in some ways, I mean, she wears it on her sleeve.
Now, James, I want to ask you, because you're usually very transparent about all your beliefs, whether it's things that will anger Democrats or Republicans. Regardless of who wins tonight, do you think do Democrats have a chance of winning, or are they likely to win in November? Like, what does that likelihood look like for them?
I mean, if a tornado hits tonight and only Jamie Rittenauer's votes get counted, then Lindsay gets her way, then yeah, maybe Democrats have a chance, but otherwise, no. I don't think Democrats have much of a chance in November. I mean, certainly anything can happen. Certainly, there are months for scandals or for just any crazy story to come out, or changes that, to health status. Anything can happen. But assuming a normal next few months, no, I think anyone who comes out of the Republican primary tonight is going to win in November.
And also keep in mind, too, at the top of the ticket, Donald Trump could be in a jail cell by the time the election rolls around, because he's got his trial going on right now in New York. And he's got some other legal issues out there as well. So if you tie your boat to the Trump campaign, be careful, because there's probably an iceberg out there somewhere.
Yeah, but most of them seem to want to do that. I mean, yeah, you have Braun touting the endorsement, and then the others obviously still have bragged about their support too. So I think they're all kind of counting on that going well. So so we'll see. I do want to talk about another race that we're watching tonight, Indiana's 6th congressional district, which covers a portion of Marion County. Jefferson Shreve, who just ran for Indy Mayor last year, is one of the candidates in the race. James, what do you think of his attempts to pivot to a more conservative electorate in this primary?
So I'm continually befuddled by Jefferson Shreve. I covered him, and as someone who lost to him in a mayoral primary.
But he spent $2 million to beat me, so there you go.
I covered him a little bit when he was on the city county council. I talked to him a bunch of times. He was very thoughtful. I thought he took his job very seriously on the council. Had a lot of ideas, but the campaigns he's run, he's 3 of them in the past 8 years. He ran for state senate, he ran for Indianapolis mayor, now he's running for Congress. It's hard to see the actual human being that is Jefferson Shreve through like the campaign ads and the weird, like made in a lab caricature that is Jefferson Shreve that comes through these ads. It's really bizarre. And for example, when he was running for mayor a year ago, he introduced proposals that would tighten gun restrictions in Indianapolis even more so than Indiana allows by law. Now he's like the big Second Amendment guy running for Congress. It's a really strange shift. He seems to, no matter what he's running for, just tailor his campaign very generically to that voting audience. But at the same time, a guy who has spent as many millions of dollars as he has to get elected, there's like a part of me that's like kind of like rooting for him. Like he wants this more desperately than almost any candidate I've ever seen. And there's like part of me that's like, oh, I hope he gets something out of this. I hope he finds his fulfillment that he's looking for.
Yes, tonight the night, you think? Yeah. I mean, is it?
I mean, it certainly has a good chance. No prediction there, but again, he spent a lot of money to win, and that money means a lot.
Yeah, Abdul, obviously, you mentioned you ran against him last year. What are your thoughts on his pivot?
I think the pivot is, obviously it's a different audience. And the thing is, what his opponents have sort of failed to do is capitalize on his positions on abortion, on guns. Like, hey, when he ran for mayor, he said this, but here he's saying this. But if you don't have the delivery system, i.e. the money to compete, that message doesn't get out to the rank and file type voters. So they just know him from his commercials. But if there's no one out there sort of pushes, hey, he flip-flopped on abortion, flip-flopped on guns, it doesn't really matter.
I want to talk about another column that James wrote encouraging Democrats to vote Republican in the election. We saw today, I think I saw a couple people when we talked to voters say that that's what they did. They were Democrats, but they decided to vote for Republicans. Lindsay, what do you think of that sort of plea, that push to have Republicans or to have Democrats pull Republican ballots?
If anything, I think it's a great civic education initiative. Frankly, we showed a lot of people that they can, how our system works and what the pros and cons are to, of course, taking another ballot aside from your party, if you will. Had some folks ask me today what I thought about doing that, and obviously it's your vote. You know, if it sits with you that you want to go vote for what might be perceived as the least possible, the least worst candidate, since you believe that Democrats may not have a shake this year in the gubernatorial race, then go for it. I personally can't vote my values that way. I can't take a Republican ticket. That's not who I am. That's not how I vote. That's not how I view the world. That's not how I believe Indiana should be shaped in terms of my candidate for this race. Now, you and I both know there's lots of crap that we agree on at the Statehouse, and that there's more days at the Statehouse where stuff gets passed than that's completely mutually beneficial to both parties and everyone's on board. A lot of those bills pass through like 90-0.
Yeah.
And so, or in the House, and obviously close to 50-0 in the Senate. So there's really far more on which I truly believe that Indiana Democrats and Indiana Republicans agree than disagree. It just so happens that those items that we've been voting on these past 2 years since special session of 2022, where we saw the abortion bill, Senate Enrolled Act 1 pass, that we've just transitioned into a just very divisive time in space, and obviously that's been driven by a lot of national politics. But I mean, that's your vote. You do with it what you want, as long as you know that you're not going to be able to be on the ballot yourself in any sort of contested race as a Democrat in the next 2 elections until you pull 2 more. Now, we could have a whole thesis about whether or not that's a good law and we need to repeal it, but we'll save that for another day.
Yeah, we could talk about that for an hour.
We might agree on that.
James, why, obviously I mentioned it was a column you wrote that was encouraging that. Why do you think that was a good idea for Democrats to consider doing?
Well, I think it's something we've talked about here, which I really don't think it's likely that Democrats are going to win in November. So if you are a reality-based voter and you're surveying the field and you're trying to figure out who you want to be the next governor, what values you want them to represent, the most consequential vote you'll cast this year, if that's your top priority, is in the Republican primary today for governor. So just as a matter of practicality, that's like the obvious move. There are a couple of reasons that people get mad about that. If you're on the Republican side, some people got mad because they think I'm suggesting that Democrats go sabotage a campaign or an election, but that's not the case. I'm suggesting people with an earnest belief that there's one candidate better than the rest in that field should go, cast that vote. These are, taxpayer-funded elections. Like, people have rights to go vote. So if that's how you feel, you should do it. But Democrats got mad because they say that it messes with their data, and Democrats need to fundraise off voter data and primary voting and all of that. But again, I would suggest people who actually care who the next governor is have a more consequential decision, and that's having a say in the next governor.
Yeah.
It's like being a Hamilton County Democrat. All the actions on the Republican side.
Right.
Of issues. However, I will say this: we really need to sort of rethink the way we elect elected officials in Indiana, because to me, a primary is a political party function. And why should someone who's an independent or not a Democrat or Republican be forced to pay for political parties to pick their own candidates? Go pay for it yourself or have a nominating convention. But if you're going to have a situation where the taxpayers are footing the bill, then it should be sort of an open primary system, maybe ranked choice voting or cumulative voting or something along those lines, where you have the top 2 vote getters, they face off in the general election going forward. But as long as the taxpayers are footing the bill, I think the political parties should pay for it should be an open primary. You should vote for whoever you want.
Fascinating. Yeah. We don't know who will win tonight, and I know I'm running out of time here before our show is up. And I know you guys need to get on your way. But the next thing on the horizon is the summer Republican and Democratic conventions, where party insiders will pick their lieutenant governor candidates. In the past, that's usually the governor saying, hey, this is who I want to be the LG. But this year it's a little bit different on the Republican side, because we have Micah Beckwith, who said, I am running, regardless of who wins. I am running for LG, and we've heard some rumors about some other people considering it as well. I guess, how do you expect that to shake out, James?
Well, by the way, Micah Beckwith is one of the people who got mad at me for saying that Democrats should vote in Republican primaries, and he is doing one of the weirdest campaign schemes I've ever seen in my life, running exclusively for lieutenant governor without being attached to a gubernatorial candidate. I honestly don't know how it's going to play out. I think those conventions are unpredictable. You don't know. You take. If you assume the Republican primary electorate today is very right-leaning, the convention goers are even further to the right and much more unpredictable. So I wouldn't say it's impossible that he could come out of there. Unlikely, probably, but it's anything can happen.
Yeah, Abdul, is Beckwith pulling this maneuver. Is this a good thing for the Republican Party or a bad thing?
Well, I always argue, number one, more candidates is always better. More choice is always a better thing. I did convince my wife, the lovely Mrs. Shabazz, begrudgingly, to run as a delegate to the Republican state convention, because between the contested attorney general's race and a probably contested lieutenant governor's race, she gets all their literature and all their back and forth, and we sort of kind of work through the process ourselves. So we'll see what happens this evening if she becomes a convention delegate or not. With that said, however, I do think that if you can only run so far to the right before people start to push back, because remember Curtis Hill. He won the primary, or he won the convention for attorney general. We saw with Curtis Hill, who's still a good friend, had his prospective issues. So it'll be interesting to see how that all sort of breaks out this summer.
Yeah, Lindsay, do you think a Micah Beckwith LG candidate would matter in a general election?
Do I think it would matter to voters?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, I do. Especially if you have a weird dynamic that would. Voters pick up on stuff really quick. A lot of people, as working on campaigns for 20 years, you see a lot. And I always dislike a candidate who underestimates their voters, because that is just the cardinal sin. If you are not able to see that perhaps they get a sense or a vibe or a feel, like, you are wrong. They've got it. They've got that sense. That downward trend you see in polling for Braun, that's tangible. It's quantifiable, clearly. Whether polling is a good thing, we will we'll leave that aside. But yeah, I think that has tremendous value, and he's got a playbook to do this now that Diego Morales completely upended the convention in 2022. I think it was correct. Yep. Okay, and so he's got the playbook. He sees a way it can be effective, and he sees how this young man in Diego Morales has paved the path forward to do this successfully. And despite leaving a catastrophic path behind him, with literally the worst campaign that perhaps I've ever seen run and still win, I really don't see it as being anything but a playbook for Micah.
Got it. Well, we are going to be wrapping up here. We do have a little bit more election results in. We're about 9% of voters tallied. So right now, Mike Braun is still in the lead with 37.9% of the vote. Suzanne Crouch following behind with 21.5%. Brad Chambers at 19.4%. And the other candidates lining in behind those candidates. Again, we'll have updated results for you all night at IndyStar.com, so just check back after we are off the air. Thank you again for our guests. We have James Briggs, Abdul-Hakim Shabazz, and Lindsay Haake, as well as our IndyStar reporters, Brittany Carloni and Kayla Dwyer, who joined us earlier in the night. So stay tuned to IndyStar.com. We'll have results for you all night.